This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another podcast. This is the DarshanTalks podcast. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni, and it's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. In case you haven't heard this from me a few thousand times, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA-regulated company or its products, this is the podcast for you. Today's podcast. It's a topic you've never seen me talk about. I never discuss this because it doesn't interest me at all. It's completely irrelevant. This idea of patient centricity. So if you are in patient centricity, if you are in transparency, if you are in clinical research, if you are in advertising and promotion, if you are developing a new product and trying to figure out how does your product fit into the patient's life, you want to talk about today's product, you want to listen in, you want to hear more about what we're doing. Our guest today is, how should we put this? She is a patient advocacy zealot. You don't get to use the word zealot in a positive sense very often. So it's nice to have that opportunity. A patient centricity, a patient advocacy zealot. She's the senior manager of patient support, stakeholder experience at Otsuka, which is, I feel like Otsuka really enjoys mouthful titles. Patient support stakeholder experience, PSSE, if you will. But that, I'm really excited to have you on. Our guest for today, a pharmacist as well, Erica Devine. Hey, Erica.
Hey, Darshan, how are you?
Good. I'm excited. I get to talk to you. I'm admiring the artwork in your background. I'm seeing the fancy titles in the background. So which degrees are those, by the way?
So funny enough, my husband and I share an office. So these are actually his degrees. They look a little different back in their frames. But I can definitely share a little bit of background with my degrees, which are a little bit more on the side area of the wall. So I am a PharmD, trained as a pharmacist. I also took the board certification for ambulatory care through BPS. So I do have the board certification through that as well. So it's actually quite interesting if we're talking about just kind of the journey that our paths take. I actually had not foreseen that my life was going to leave clinical practice. So at the time I was looking to earn my board certification, it was just about that time I had made a career change into industry. And so at the time, people said, you still want to go for that? Like, do you really need it now that you're not clinically practicing and treating patients? And honestly, I'm so glad that I did, because it really helps me. It keeps me committed to keeping up with current trends from the pharmacy side and just healthcare in general, and really being able to speak to guidelines, updates as they relate to patients. So I think it just forces me to keep a pulse on kind of the clinical side of practice, even though I'm not working with it directly in that capacity every day.
So we should add one thing, which was a conversation Erica had with me before we even started. So I want to clarify. This discussion does not reflect the opinion necessarily of Erica, of myself, or of Otsuka. So we can be clear that this is true, and we can stop the disclaimer at the bottom. So I want to make sure that we've got that covered. I do have a question for you, Erica. So you started off as a clinical pharmacist, and then you left that role. I missed the component because I was trying to get some of this stuff ready. Did you say you still practice?
No. So I left practice right around 2016. So that was when I segued from kind of a retail and actually what migrated into a specialty pharmacy operations role. And then I had jumped into industry. So I left pharmacy practice in order to kind of segue into the commercial side of a small specialty pharmaceutical company that had products that treated substance use disorders and mental health. So it was a very big career change for me at the time, but one that I was really excited to make at that moment.
So you say this really interesting thing where you said that, and I'm sorry, we'll get to patient centricity at some point,
Sure.
At this moment, this journey you've taken is so fascinating to me, because I talk to a lot of pharmacists, and they always talk about, what should we do? The three options that always pop up: I want to do retail, I want to do hospital, and I want to do industry. And I'm kind of going, okay, I get the retail thing. I've done all three, but I get the retail thing. The hospital, for the most part, yes, you're working in hospital pharmacy. There are a couple of roles in there, but it's you get the general gist of it. Industry, when people talk about, they don't understand it's a whole field of options.
Absolutely. And I don't think you could have nailed it any better than that. Totally agree, Darshan. And what's interesting, and maybe I'm dating myself here, but when I graduated, 85% of my class went into retail, because that's what you did. You had 6 offers in a retail setting 6 months before you graduated. And that was kind of just the trajectory for pharmacists back then. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody could have foreseen how the pharmacy industry was going to just evolve. And so we're seeing a lot of clinical services being added on in the retail setting. Pharmacists no longer just dispense medications and counsel patients in that way, but they also are administering vaccinations, and they're holding wellness clinics, and now they're testing COVID patients, and they're doing all kinds of ambulatory care services for patients. And so I think that, I know for me, when I graduated, there wasn't really a lot of discussion around pharmacists' roles within life sciences companies. So when I graduated, it was really like, you either do retail, or you do hospital, or you go into residency. And the residency were really primarily focused around clinical practice. And what we're starting to see a lot of, and what I'm learning is, pharmacists have a critical role to play in life sciences companies. And I think a lot of times pharmacists think it primarily sits with the medical science liaison role, or more of that medical affairs role. But there are so many function areas within a pharmaceutical company where pharmacists really can play a role in a lot of different ways. So I think you nailed it. I don't think you could have hit that any better, to say that there's a lot of roles that could really benefit from the expertise that a pharmacist training brings.
So I think that's kind of interesting, right? You talked about the medical affairs role, if you will, because that's the traditional thought process. The other one I hear a lot of is pharmacovigilance.
Yep.
But oddly, and I think this is a mistake in most cases, I've met a lot of the exceptions, but the other one you get a lot of is, I can go into clinical research, and I can name on one hand the number of pharmacists in clinical research, and I can name thousands on the other hand who are not pharmacists.
Yep.
But you do that unique positioning of patient centricity, which is, let's be honest, it's a whole emerging industry. It's only been emerging for 20 years, which is the bizarre part of emerging in this case. But it's getting more and more interest. So what I want to hear a little bit more about is, what is the type of patient centricity you have observed? So we're not speaking specifically about the company you're with, but there are, I've done a ton of work in patient centricity, and there are, at least in my opinion, 4 different places it kicks in. The first is in designing clinical research. The second is in marketing. The third is in approval, and I'm forgetting. And the fourth is in regulatory. So what I'm referring to is things like what is the transparency pathway you're going to consider, and how is that playing in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like that's one viewpoint. What is your perspective? What do you see?
So I think that's a great start, Darshan. I think that the 4 function areas you've kind of laid out there is critical to being able to tell that patient story and better build programs and products that serve patients in the way that they really need it and value. But there's a lot of other areas that I think patient centricity really plays a role into. And I think this is a very interesting discussion topic, because what we're talking about here is really those primary roles that we see having more of the direct patient caregiver touch points across an organization. But I think in order to really carry out a patient-centric model, you have to look at all the function areas and really be able to get those areas to see that even though there are segmentation or maybe degrees of separation between what the role is and how they ultimately serve our end user, which is patients and caregivers, that's really the way you're going to thread that throughout all of your programs and initiatives. If you miss that in any one of those areas, because it really is a chain and one informs the other, and there's a lot of interdependence between them. So to name a couple of function areas, Darshan, in addition to what you've mentioned, health economics outcomes research, very critical, I think, in understanding patient experience. I would also say patient support programs. So, the patient support side and the function area that really puts the programs together to help access, affordability, and really just kind of sets those programs up to help patients navigate how they get treatment. I would add that it almost touches every area and maybe is more critical to the ones that maybe don't have a direct line of sight as to how what they do every day impacts the patients directly. So let's take it to finance. Let's talk it to our legal compliance and ethics folks too. Like, I think there's ways in which we can build ideas around how we impact patients at the end of the day across all function areas. And to me, that is probably more important than just looking at the function areas that might have the most optics around touching patients and caregivers.
You've touched, first of all, great discussion on some of the areas that get ignored. Could you talk a little bit about the patient's role in the HEOR and in the context of patient support programs? I mean, from a patient support program, there's the obvious, which is, well, they'd be the ones getting supported. But Is there a role for the patient in terms of designing the programs? Have you seen that done? And what are the limitations?
So we could probably talk about that for the whole hour, right, Darshan? So yes, there are considerations, I think, around how we engage with patients. I would say that I think that in industry as a whole, and you being an attorney that's worked so heavily in the FDA regulatory space knows all too well, it's interesting with pharmaceutical companies, it's the most highly regulated industry. And so I think in the past and just historically, there's been some shifts, not only from who our end user is. Most of the life sciences companies tend to have a very healthcare provider-centric model. And we're starting to see that shift where the healthcare provider is critical in the journey that patients take in their treatment journey. But they also are more of the support and the influencer, the enablers that help that patient get to where they need to be. So I think that's an important note, like just to say from the industry as a whole, realizing that there are regulatory, policies that are in place that really set guardrails on how industry can interact with patients and caregivers. But I also think just working from a health economics outcomes research perspective, if you're looking at that particular function area, that's really tasked to provide, the financial value and the optimal patient outcomes, and be able to say this is why a treatment might want to be considered for a certain patient population. And while those that side of the organization might liaise more so with the payers, they are still the ones that are also working with the researchers to understand what is that real world evidence coming in. It's critical to understand, how to support programs that life sciences companies put into place. How do they set patients up for better outcomes at the end of the day? So when I look at that, to me, the HEOR really helps to set the hard data, which I would see marrying with some of the feedback and experience data that comes in, because you have to have the whole picture. You can't just take one or the other, or you're going to have blind spots that you're not speaking to. And so yes, HEOR is absolutely critical in getting that patient experience. Now, they might work with vendors, for instance, that do the research. They might have some liaisons that work with the patients. I know it's blinded. It's not like they directly do patient and caregiver outreach, but they are most certainly capturing data around, cost utilization, patient outcomes, health-related quality of life, and that quality improvement aspect that really speaks to the value-based orientation of how healthcare is delivered today.
So it's interesting you say that, and I don't know if you have exposure or visibility into this area yet, but when you're working in developing the impact of patients on the process, if you will, of drug approval, do you see regulatory and compliance in those discussions on how do we bring patients in the context of these clinical trials? I mean, I'll give you my perspective. From a legal regulatory standpoint, that worries me. Not because I don't want it to happen, but because the rules and regulations are so fuzzy, if not straight up unclear, if not straight up hostile. On one hand, you have the FDA really advocating for patients to be part of clinical research in every form, whether we're talking about HEOR, that's health economics and outcomes research, all the way through to finding patient-reported outcomes, etc. But on the other hand, from a promotional standpoint, they're kind of going, well, we're going to consider what you say and who you market to as potential intended use. And the implications of that intended use can be billions of dollars in fines. So the balancing act is very complicated. So I guess my question to you, and I didn't want to sort of go off on a soliloquy of my own, but how do you, when you're acting in the best interest of the patient, which is awesome to see companies doing that.
Yep.
How do you take the position of, look, we're trying to further the interests of the patients here. Yep. We know what the FDA's overall goal is, which is advocating for patients to be more involved, but recognizing some of these other non-conforming regulations, for lack of a better term. How do you advocate for the patients to be more involved through HEOR research, through the process of HEOR research?
So one thing I do have to say, Darshan, HEOR is another functionary I do not necessarily report into. So, I think, somebody that would have more expertise working on that side would probably be able to speak to that a little bit better. What I can say just from a more general standpoint, and I think your point is extremely well taken, and I can definitely say that this is probably one of the most critically important things that life sciences companies, get right. Because again, yes, we are all trying to understand our patient better and our caregivers better, but there has to be an absolute robust discussion with our legal and compliance and, really the part of the organization that really keeps us doing things in the right way and really is speaking to protecting patients in the best way that we can. So I think I think it's important to know, that all different functionaries have different ways of capturing their data, and I'm sure they have compliance guardrails around the way that they work. As far as the regulatory and development of drugs, the clinical trial area isn't even part of, that can be completely separated from really the commercialization side. And, I can even say from patient support, we're looking at it from a point of clinical conviction. So, we're not necessarily looking at it from a perspective of what happens before, a healthcare provider looks and says, hey, this is the appropriate treatment for this particular patient. So I think the biggest challenges, and Darshan, you probably have heard this many, many times, and I think it's kind of set up this way again because there's these strict guardrails in place that there's a lot of data coming into the organization, and I think everybody is trying to figure out how they best can serve patients. I think it tends to be more siloed though, because again, we're still trying to figure that out. Like, how do you do this in a compliant way? And we want to always make sure that we are putting the patient's best interest forward. So, I think that is a discussion that is ongoing all the time. I will tell you right now, I am not the expert in regulatory and compliance. We have a whole team of experts that work in that capacity and make sure that, anything that we would be looking at doing, so whether it be journey mapping, whether it be, collating data or anything like that, that absolutely has to be a robust discussion with our legal folks to say, hey, there might be another way we can look at this, or no, there's certain things that you're just not going to be able to do based on the regulations that are in place.
So that raises so many interesting questions. And I can go down all of them just from a legal regulatory perspective. But what I really want to start off by thinking about is the absolute basic of this process. Erica, I'm going to tell you this. You're now the head of a new patient-centricity program of a new pharmaceutical company. You're
Okay.
now I'm going to build this to be a patient-centric organization. Where do you start building something like this? What do you go, these interlocking chains, these interlocking loops, they feed into each other. Do you go really early on? Or do you go, look, we first need to have something viable?
Yeah.
And so where do you start? How do you sort of design this?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I would say to Darshan, the one thing we would have to even take a step back before we even look at any of that is, do we have an aligned mission, right? Like what does the culture look like in the organization? So, this is something I think that is critically important before you can even start to look at the tactics and which function areas you bring into this, and how do you start to stitch together the whole story, or any of the things that we put into place to really visually represent that patient's journey and really the discovery and the understanding around what that really looks like. The culture has to be set in place too. So, you have to have an organizational buy-in. You have to have leadership buy-in, and then you have to have really this continuous discussion around why, this is not only the right thing to do, but from a business perspective, it's critically important that we get the experience part right. So I think culturally, and I think this is something we have to kind of almost separate out, because I think sometimes when people hear the term patient centricity, people's minds tend to think, okay, well, what types of things am I going to just put into place? Like, what kind of initiatives can we put into place to kind of speak to the fact that we are taking actions that will get us to this place? And, that's understandable, because we all want to see outputs for, the work that's being done. But I think also we can't miss the fact that, one, the culture and the support structure has to be set up first, and it has to be set in place. And we also have to really make sure we're doing more of that understanding and discovery part of it. So just to add a little bit more to that, I think just in my own personal experience, working in a lot of different ways with life sciences companies, we tend to have a lot of data coming in regarding activity metrics, right? Like, we know what's happening, and then we have kind of the business impact metrics. So, the one part that we kind of miss in the middle sometimes, and I think that this is really the secret sauce as to how you really frame out that voice of customer, is the why. Like, why are things happening the way that they are, and really taking it from, you'll hear patient centricity is all about putting patients first, they should be the center and core of everything that we do. But I think another way to say that, Darshan, would be, for the longest time, we've probably been looking at how we can kind of steer patients to where we want them to be versus looking at it from the patient's first, point of view and saying, how do we actually meet them where they are? So where they're actually the drivers of their healthcare journey, and we're really just serving as passengers, and we're just lovingly telling them what, that journey looks like, or saying, hey, this might be a little bit easier way to navigate the route you're trying to go. So I think it starts with culture. I also think it also has to be part of like earning the buy-in across the organization, just because different function areas have different metrics by which they might be prioritizing over others. And then if you're looking at how do you stitch together, right? How do you stitch together all of the function areas? Because, life sciences companies they're very complex. They have a lot of different working parts. I think you do have to decide as an organization that you can't eat the elephant all at one time. You have to decide, what is going to be your strategy, moving forward. Is there a certain critical few areas that we really want to hone in on first, really understand that journey and the multiple ways that patients can walk that through with us, and seeing, areas of opportunity where we can either fix, enhance, or, fill in gaps that might not be there. So I think it all starts with discovery first. You have to really lay the framework before you can start saying, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z to start meeting the needs of the patient. Lastly, I would say, because there's so much data, I don't think there's a problem with the amount of data. Like, we all have access to data, it's coming in all kinds of forms. But I think the part that sometimes can lead you astray is that a data set can lead to multiple conclusions sometimes. And so what happens is you start to make assumptions about what patients need versus really drilling down a little further and really understanding, like, is my assumption about what a patient needs really validated?
So I'm a little worried. As we discussed, this is usually a 20 to 30 minute discussion. We're already hitting the edge of it. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but we're going to need to have another version of this, another talk soon. Because I am chomping at the bit to ask you about data, but I'm trying to not go down that rabbit hole.
Sure.
There's just so much there. What I really enjoyed you talking about is this idea of culture and organization buy-in, and this idea of continuous discussion. I guess it starts off by really discussing who's the customer, which is something you pointed out early. The funny part of that statement is that usually the way the word customer is defined is the person who pays. If not, it's the person who chooses. It's rarely the person who uses.
Yes.
So in this specific instance, the payer is different from the prescriber, is different from the user or the patient.
Yep.
Obviously, all three roles matter, but we've reached this new paradigm, which is still not as universally accepted as it probably should be, considering the patient in the end is probably the linchpin to all of this. So my question is, in this fictional company where you are head of patient centricity and designing all things patient, how do you go about building that culture? Do you start off by saying, you know what, we're going to have a powwow and we're going to rebuild the company's motto? Or are you going to go, let's have weekly meetings and emphasize the importance of patient centricity? Or is it something completely different?
So I think it's a great question. And I think it's also a complex one, because culture is something that is not necessarily tangible. So the best way I've heard it described is it's really about how do you change it from, again, the mindset that because I'm putting a certain initiative together or I'm putting a project together, that means that now we're patient-centric. I think that tends to kind of get muddied sometimes, that, really what we're looking at is it was really the credo of the organization. So maybe it is having a succinct mission statement that centers around patients specifically. So the strategy around the patient specifically is, I think, critical. And if it's not, not part of the larger organizational mission, maybe that's something that's put into place. But I think there has to be a very well-aligned idea of what it is we're looking to do, and have a very clear idea of who the end user really is. So I thought that was interesting you brought that up, and this is an evolution. So we've, healthcare there's a lot of stakeholders, right? So healthcare providers, you've got your payers, you've got your healthcare institutions, just to name a few. And when you look at it, I think it's still taking the mindset that even though we might be working with different stakeholders within that capacity, you still need to thread it back to, well, how does that action that I'm working with an intermediary impact the patient experience at the end? So I think, again, it's still kind of retooling the mindset. When you say, what kinds of things do you do? I think you have to make it a very consistent and a very repeated conversation. I think the closest thing you can do, and this is just my own opinion, Darshan, is that you have to share patients and caregiver stories. Like, you have to bring those out in multiple channels that are accessible, and then have brainstorming sessions. Maybe it's around meetings, national meetings, whatever. You have to continually bring that back and put it on the forefront of people's minds. The other thing I would say, it's also so much about the language we use. So, it's funny. I thought that was a great segue, Darshan. You said, well, we talk about customers, we talk about users, we talk about even patients. And I think one of the things I'd like to do is even take that a step further back, because really at the end of the day, we are all human beings that are only separated by the experiences that we have. And they're, those can be unique experiences, but at any given day, we could be the patient, we could be the caregiver, we could be the provider, we could be any of those things. And so really, I think that we have to be very careful about how we discuss patients or humans, individuals that, might be living with a certain condition. Because I think as soon as we start even talking about, well, that's the patient, I work as an employee, we've already created a gap, right? That they're patients, and now my mind isn't necessarily putting myself in their shoes. So I think that is critically important that, we kind of keep bringing that ethos back. And then also, I think it's really about challenging everybody. So whether it be people working in finance, maybe it's people in legal and regulatory, maybe it's people in patient support, which we're all lucky because we work with patients every day. So it's a little bit clearer for us, maybe to draw that line between A and B, but really almost have those, and I'm a big proponent of human-centered design thinking. So I love of the way to tease out people's kind of thoughts and get them thinking about these things is really, how do they draw the connection to what they do? So if they were to look at what their job description was, and they were to say, how does that trickle down? What's the ripple effect down to the patient at the end of the day? I think that almost helps them remember, there's a greater purpose to what we do as an organization. And, and I think that, the more that we can just, again, it can't be just at the annual meeting. It can't just be done, during our regional meetings. This has to be a consistent discussion. And I think that it really requires, we have to become more connected to the people that we serve, and we have to continually make it a mission to discover and understand what their journey looks like and how we may just come into contact in that journey, not necessarily, well, this is where we are and this is our understanding of where patients kind of come into contact with us. So I think it's really meeting them where they are versus driving patients where we want them to be.
So I have so many questions about human-centered design, tying into how do you meet patients where they are. But before we, but we're gonna have to just have you back because there's just so much more. I want to talk about data so badly, but I'm trying to hold off. We'd love to have you back again soon. But what is one question you'd like to ask the audience who's probably listening in? I'm already seeing people. At this moment, there are several people on LinkedIn watching. So what is a question you'd like the audience to answer for us?
So I would like to know, what are our audience members looking for from life sciences companies? Yeah. Because when I think about it, and one of the things that we were even working through on some of the brainstorming sessions around patient centricity was I wanted to have colleagues think about their either worst, best, or whatever experience that was with any particular company, or maybe it was as a caregiver or taking care of somebody that they loved or themselves. What did that experience look like? And in that moment, what did they expect? And if it wasn't delivered in that manner, what would they have changed? And so I think that's really the important part, is understanding, what do they feel life sciences companies could be doing better, or pharmaceutical companies could be doing better in this space?
So I'll give my answer, because I think that usually it's useful to start off from someplace. I think what life sciences companies can do better in general is, first of all, I think there's a lot of lip service. A lot of companies are like, I think you hinted at that early on in the conversation where you said people are asking the question, what can I do to demonstrate that I'm patient-centric? Not so much being patient-centric, but demonstrate that they're patient-centric. So it's almost that checking the box, the ticking the box thought process, as opposed to how do we realign the processes so that we're truly meeting the goals? Because I truly believe, based on most of the people I talk to, life sciences companies, for the most part, are in it. Most of the people who work for them are in it to actually help patients.
Absolutely.
So if that's true, why don't we do a better job demonstrating that? And I think part of it is because we think about things from the perspective of what makes my job easiest. And it's hard to get to think about something through someone else's eyes.
Yes.
And it's a lazy way that we all do this. But it's lazy to go, I know what they want. It's obvious. And time again, we've learned when you make assumptions, you make an ass out of you and me. So, that would be my answer. I'm going to ask a couple of quick rapid fire questions. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay. What is an accomplishment you're most proud of?
Honestly, this would probably go back to my clinical practice days. At the time, we were serving a very large opioid use disorder patient population that also had dual diagnosis, mental health conditions. And I will never forget, and this is just one story, I think, to highlight a lot of experiences I had and why this was so fulfilling. Probably in a selfish way, it was so fulfilling to me. One, it made it very clear that mental health patients and those suffering from addiction, it's a population not well advocated for. Let me put it that way. So I had a patient come in. She was with her son, and he was not in a really good way. He had just been discharged, and I told her at the time. She said, "Hey, do you carry this medication? We're just trying to, take care of this." And I said, "You know what? I just want to let you know, we will do whatever we need to take care of him." And she looked at me and she said, "Thank you." She goes, "For, acknowledging that my son was a human being, because she had been to 4 different places before my pharmacy, and they all told her, we just don't carry it. Yeah, we don't service that population, essentially. And so, I kind of made it a mission back then to kind of, try to always put my judgments aside and understand that, I'd be really on my high horse if I thought that maybe my own children one day or somebody in my family couldn't be in that same place, and that I would only want the best level of care and empathy from anybody that would be walking that journey with me. So I would say that's probably one of the things I'm most proud of, was being able to kind of take in a population that maybe not so many people understand very well.
That's awesome. By the way, I have a couple more questions, but we have a comment from Paul Verde. Great discussion. So important to ask what the patients really want to see, how they want to engage, and design processes around it. At the moment, sponsors make their own assumptions on what patient centricity should be. So I agree with that statement.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I'm going to ask another question. When are you most inspired?
I think when I hear direct patient caregiver stories, and I think it's not always how we fixed or solved a problem for them. I think it's sometimes just hearing the challenge that they live with every day, and then being able to say, it's like an aha moment to say, oh my gosh, we could be doing something, so we could be doing something better. And again, I think it just goes back to those assumptions. Like, we think we are doing a great job. I think if you ask anybody, I think human beings by nature, Darshan, are empathetic and compassionate and want to do what's right. But I think the challenge is sometimes we just don't really know how to go about it. So we throw tactics at it, right? Because we think if we just throw things in action, that's the best way to show that we're doing something. And I think that kind of makes you take a pause and say, we really need to know the story a little bit better before we can start acting on it.
How do you define success?
By continually improving that experience, and really the outcome, I think, is more to it. If we can make one day in the life of one of our patients a bit better, I think that that's success in and of itself.
Very cool. And what's the best vacation you've ever taken?
Oh, that's a good one. I would have to say Costa Rica.
Oh, nice. Why Costa Rica?
So interestingly enough, we went to Costa Rica. It's a beautiful country. It was right before, it was our honeymoon. So it was right before, like, we were, having kids and all of that. But we did a day excursion to Nicaragua. And I will say the experience of that in and of itself, because I remember the resort and all that in Costa Rica, but I think really the memorable experience was really seeing just how another country completely lives. And then being able to just see some of the wonders. We saw this volcano there, Masai, and you could look down into the crater. It was the most incredible experience. So I'd have to say that might be my favorite of all. But I love vacations, any vacations,
especially now. If you were a superhero, what would your powers be?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think it would be probably to have that empathic ability. Like, I would be able to feel exactly what people feel when I was interacting with them.
Interesting. If you won $1 million, what would you buy?
$1 million. I would probably just put a big chunk of it away so my kids would just have their college education set up and wouldn't have to worry about that part. And then this is probably very boring, but I'd probably just pay off our house, and then knowing me, I'd probably just squander the rest and put it in savings, and then maybe pick some charities. I'd probably just distribute some to charity, but then I would just kind of put it in a savings account somewhere.
We have such a very different view on what squandering means. I'm going to quote what you just said. I'm going to squander the rest and pay off my loans. Those may not be terms that should typically go together. But okay.
Squander the overage, Darshan.
Okay, got it. Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Just like put it away in a savings account or something, which is so boring, but that's like, it's kind of probably realistically what I would do with it.
Okay, fair enough. Last one. If you were going to design a 2020 Mount Rushmore, who would be the first person on it?
Ruth Bader.
Okay. Why RBG?
Oh, I just love her. I just think she is such a fierce advocate for women, but I also think she had such emotional intelligence. And I just loved it when she said, you have to be able to say things in a way to get people to listen to you. And I think that is so incredibly key. So I just think she's just so smart. And the fact that she was able to support her husband, while he was in law school and he was working through, an illness, she's like a superhuman to me. I just love her. She was wonderful.
Very, very cool. So I just want to do a quick recap. During this conversation, we talked about your journey. We talked about how you started off as a ambulatory care pharmacist. We talked about how you left clinical practice, got into patient centricity with a stopover in another role previously. You then spoke a little bit about what are the different roles in patient centricity. We talked about a couple of different examples and you added to them. You talked about HEOR, you talked about patient support programs. You talk about some of the areas that the patient centricity really hits, but don't necessarily get the visibility. Places like finance, legal, compliance, ethics. We talked a little bit about the rules and regulations that make it a little bit harder to truly engage with patients. We talked about the concept of intended use. We talked about you designing your own company that is patient-centric. And the role and the impact that it has on the model. You talk about what would creating a patient-centric culture look like. One of my favorite lines, and I've used it all the time myself, is you can't eat an elephant all at one time. And that is probably the big takeaway from this episode, because there's so much to do and you can go, here's a fixed beginning, here's a fixed end, and we're done. It's going to be a continuously evolving process. We talk about the different types of customers, the payers, the prescribers, and the patients themselves, and how each of them has a different role to play. But in the end, I think payers, providers, and pharma can all agree the only customer that matters is the patient. Yeah. So I think those would be the big things. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that was great.
Okay, good. For those of you who missed it, where can they reach you, Erica?
You can find me on LinkedIn under Erica Devine. Yeah, anybody can find me on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Perfect. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me on DarshanTalks on Twitter or go to our website at darshantalks.com. Thanks again, Erica. This was wonderful having you on. By the way, Cher says very informative discussion as well.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.